They built a car doing 200 miles per hour. NASCAR banned it immediately. 1969. America is burning on two fronts at once. In Vietnam, 50,000 soldiers are already dead, and the draft lottery is pulling the names of 18-year-olds out of a bowl on national television. Back home, the country is splitting at the seams, over race, over war, over everything. And in the middle of all that noise, in the garages of Highland Park, Michigan, a small group of engineers at Chrysler Corporation is staring at a scale model made of clay, trying to figure out how to go faster than any stock car has ever gone before. Not faster by a little, faster by a margin so obscene it will force the most powerful racing organization in America to rewrite its rulebook just to keep them off the track. This is the story of the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, and it starts not with a triumph but with a humiliation. To understand what Dodge was doing and why they were willing to lose money on every single car they built, you have to go back to 1968. In those days, NASCAR was not the polished, sponsor-driven television spectacle you see today. It was raw, it was loud, and it was absolutely consumed by one question: whose car is faster? Ford, GM, and Chrysler poured millions into the sport because of one iron law that every executive in Detroit understood in his bones: win on Sunday, sell on Monday. If your car crossed the finish line first at Daytona or Talladega, you sold more of them off showroom floors on Monday morning. Simple as that. And in 1968, Ford was winning. The 1968 Ford Torino had a sleek, fastback body that slipped through the air like it was born to go fast. Chrysler's Dodge Charger, on the other hand, was beautiful but aerodynamically disastrous. The Charger had a deeply recessed front grille and a tunneled rear window that created enormous drag at high speed. And on the new NASCAR superspeedways, where cars ran flat out for hundreds of miles, that drag was a death sentence. Engineers calculated that the Charger simply could not push past 175 miles per hour, no matter how much power you stuffed under the hood. The 426 Hemi engine, one of the greatest V8s ever built in America, was being strangled by the body it lived in. Dodge went to work. They produced a special version of the Charger called the 500, fitted it with a flush grille and a reworked rear window, and arrived at the 1969 Daytona 500 full of confidence. The engineers had done their homework, the team was ready, and then Ford showed up with something nobody at Chrysler had seen coming. While Dodge was patting themselves on the back over the Charger 500, the engineers at Ford had gone back to their own drawing board. Working with legendary race shop Holman Moody, they had taken the already slippery Torino body and made it even more aerodynamically refined, stretching the front nose roughly 5 inches, lowering the roofline, and rolling the rocker panels to bring the car as close to the ground as NASCAR rules would allow. They named it after the brand new superspeedway being built in Alabama, the Torino Talladega. It was an act of pure psychological warfare, slapping Ford's name on the track that Chrysler considered its own home turf. And when Leroy Yarbrough's Talladega nosed past Charlie Glotzbach's Charger 500 on the very last lap of the 1969 Daytona 500 by less than a car length, the message from Dearborn was impossible to misread. "We are better than you. Come try us." Bob Roger, Dodge's racing director, drove back from Atlanta after watching Ford's Aero car dismantle yet another Chrysler effort and walked straight into his boss's office. What he said next set off a chain of events that would change American motorsport forever. He told Chrysler's leadership that NASCAR had gone funny car racing, that Ford was building purpose-engineered weapons disguised as streetcars, and that Dodge needed to respond with something so radical, so completely over the top, that nobody would ever catch them again. He said they should forget how practical the car was and forget how it looked, because the rules only required 500 examples to be sold to the public. Build the ultimate race car first and worry about everything else second. But what happened next inside Chrysler's boardroom was something nobody expected. Chrysler's leadership signed off on the program, but with a timeline that made the engineering team's blood run cold. The new car, the one that would carry Dodge's honor against Ford on the superspeedways, had to be ready for the grand opening of Talladega Speedway in September of 1969. That was just months away, and before the car could race, 500 street-legal versions had to be designed, built, and sitting in dealerships. Normal model development programs at any major automaker took years, Dodge was being asked to do it in months, from a standing start, while simultaneously beating the best aerodynamic engineers Ford had in the country. The head of the project was a man named Larry Rathgeb, Chrysler's Special Vehicle Group stock car engineer. He understood immediately what was being asked of him, and he got to work. Rathgeb split his team into 3 groups and gave each one a single job. The first group was to handle testing at Chrysler's Chelsea Proving Grounds, where the company had its own 5-mile high-speed banked oval. The second group, all 6 of them, were dispatched to wind tunnels, where they would work with scale models made of clay to find every aerodynamic advantage available. The third group was to oversee a Detroit firm called Creative Industries, the company that would actually build the 500 street cars Dodge needed to satisfy NASCAR's homologation rules. Creative Industries had done custom work for GM, Ford, and Chrysler for years. They knew how to move fast. They had to, because this time there was no margin for error at all. And somewhere in that frantic spring of 1969, driving a bright green Charger prototype back and forth between his office in Highland Park and the Creative Industries facility at night, Dale Reeker began to understand just how strange the car they were building was going to look. He brought his pregnant wife along on some of those late-night runs, and she would wait in the car outside while her husband and the Creative Industries team argued for hours about the wing, because the wing was the thing that was going to make this car either a legend or a laughingstock, and nobody yet knew which one it was going to be. That decision was about to be made in a room with a vice president, a set of drawings, and a question that cut right to the heart of it. God, it looks awful. Will it win races? The vice president of Dodge, Bob McCurry, looked at the drawings Larry Rathgeb and Dale Reeker had spread across his desk and said exactly what any reasonable man would say when confronted with a design that looked like nothing Detroit had ever produced before. God, it looks awful. Will it win races? Rathgeb and Reeker told him yes, absolutely, without question. McCurry studied the drawings for another moment, then gave the project his blessing and added one more thing. If anyone gets in your way, just let me know and I will keep the path clear for you. With those words, the strangest car Dodge had ever built got its green light on March 12, 1969. Now the clock was running, and it was running fast. The concept behind the Daytona was brutally simple, even if the engineering was anything but. The Charger 500 had fixed the worst aerodynamic problems of the standard Charger body, but it still was not good enough to beat Ford on the long, flat superspeedways where top speed was everything. What Chrysler needed was a car that could cut through the air at racing speed with dramatically less resistance than anything currently on the track. Rathgeb's aerodynamics team took a 3/8 scale clay model of the Charger to the wind tunnel at Wichita State University and began testing every possible configuration they could think of. What they found shaped every decision that followed. The first and most dramatic change was the nose. The standard Charger had a flat, blunt front end that hit the air like a wall at racing speed. The solution was a long, pointed nose cone made of sheet metal that extended the front of the car by 18 inches and tapered down to a sharp edge, splitting the air cleanly instead of pushing it out of the way. The nose cone wrapped around vacuum-operated hidden headlamps and gave the Daytona a profile unlike any American production car before it. When the first prototype rolled out of Creative Industries' facility, one journalist who saw it described the front end as looking like it belonged on a fighter jet rather than a stock car. He was not wrong, and that was entirely the point. But the nose alone was not enough. The wind tunnel data showed that at racing speed, the rear of the Charger generated enormous lift, which made the car dangerously unstable and actually slowed it down by pushing the body upward against the airflow. The solution to that problem was the feature that would define the Daytona forever and make it the most visually outrageous American automobile of its era: the wing. Rathgeb's team knew they needed a rear stabilizer mounted high enough above the deck to work in clean, undisturbed airflow, rather than the turbulent air that swirled directly behind the roofline. The original engineering calculation called for the wing to sit about 16 inches above the rear deck. And then the Dodge front office reminded the engineers of something they had overlooked entirely. The trunk lid still had to open. On a streetcar, you could not weld the trunk shut, which meant the wing had to be raised to clear it completely. The struts were lengthened and the wing went up to 23.5 inches tall and 58 inches wide. It was, by any measure, an absurd thing to put on an automobile. When Rieker drove the bright green Daytona prototype to Chrysler's Chelsea Proving Grounds for early testing, people stopped and stared like they had never seen a car before. Because in a very real sense, they had not. And here's the detail that makes the whole story even better. That accidental extra height, forced on the engineers by the simple mechanical necessity of opening a trunk, turned out to be an aerodynamic advantage on the racetrack. The taller mounting position put the wing in cleaner air above the roofline turbulence, and the wider struts gave NASCAR race car versions dramatically improved stability in the corners, and when the car stepped out of line at speed. What looked like a compromise born of bureaucratic practicality became one of the best engineering decisions of the entire project. The whole package, nose cone and wing together, gave the Daytona 23% less aerodynamic drag than the Charger 500 it replaced. But the clock that had been running since March was now screaming. All 500 street cars had to be sitting in dealerships by September 1st, 1969, to satisfy NASCAR's homologation rules and allow the Daytona to compete at the grand opening of Talladega Speedway 2 weeks later. Creative Industries leased an abandoned assembly plant in East Detroit and began receiving Charger R/T bodies shipped directly from Chrysler's Hamtramck facility. Workers stripped the front ends, fitted the nose cones, installed the fender scoops, revised the rear windows to sit flush with the body, fitted the trunk lid hardware, and bolted on the wings. One car at a time, on a schedule so tight there was no room for a single day's delay. Chrysler lost between $1,000 and $1,500 on every single Daytona they built, a number that would translate to somewhere around $12,000 per car in today's money. They did not care. Profit was not the point. Winning was the point. Dealers across America started receiving their Daytonas in late summer of 1969, and the reaction from the public was immediate and completely unhinged in the best possible way. A journalist from Superstock and Drag Illustrated drove a Daytona from the Midwest to the East Coast and wrote that the trip resulted in 10,000 glances, stares, and open-mouthed looks of amazement, and that state police in Ohio and Pennsylvania pulled him over not to write a ticket, but simply to ask what the car was. Dodge had received 1,200 orders from dealers and had to send urgent telegrams asking dealerships to talk their customers into buying something else, because there were only 505 Daytonas in existence, and that was all there were ever going to be. The street price was around $3,860 for the base model, roughly $300 more than a standard Charger R/T, which in today's money comes out to about $32,000. For that you got the nose, the wing, the fender scoops, and your choice of engines. A 440 cubic inch wedge making 375 horsepower, or the full-blooded 426 Hemi at 425 horsepower. On paper, the Hemi Daytona was the obvious choice for anyone who intended to go fast. On the street, both versions had the same effect. Total, absolute chaos wherever they appeared. Meanwhile, at Chrysler's Chelsea Proving Grounds, the engineering test car was already lapping the 5-mile banked oval at speeds that made the timing crew check their equipment twice. And what the stopwatches were showing was going to change everything about what Americans thought was possible in a stock car, and it was going to terrify the people running NASCAR in ways they had not yet begun to articulate. September 8, 1969. Talladega, Alabama. The brand new Alabama International Motor Speedway is opening its gates for the very first time, and it is the biggest, fastest, most terrifying oval track NASCAR has ever built. 2.66 miles around, banked at 33 degrees in the turns, with straightaways so long that cars reach speeds nobody had seriously planned for when the safety regulations were written. The crowd that shows up for the inaugural race is enormous. And sitting in the garage area, drawing more attention than anything else in the entire paddock, is the number 88 Dodge Charger Daytona, belonging to the Ray Nichols engineering team, the factory engineering mule that Larry Rathgeb had talked NASCAR into letting qualify for the race. Charlie Glotzbach climbed into the number 88 on September 10th during qualifying, pointed it down the front straight, and put his foot on the floor. The car ran a lap at 199.466 miles per hour. It was the fastest qualifying lap in NASCAR history at that moment, and it missed 200 miles per hour by a margin so small it was almost cruel. The number 88 was not raced that weekend due to a driver boycott over track safety concerns, But the qualifying lap had announced to everyone in motorsport exactly what Dodge had built and what it intended to do with it. The production Daytonas that ran in the actual race that day had a more complicated afternoon. Bobby Isaac and the other Dodge drivers quickly discovered that the Daytona was so fast on the banking that it was destroying its tires in ways nobody had anticipated. Goodyear would not build a tire rated for sustained running at 200 miles per hour, and Firestone could not. Larry Rathgeb said it plainly years later. After 5 laps at full speed, you were out of rubber, and that is not good at all. The Dodge drivers had to develop a strategy of making short charge spurts at full speed and then dropping back to let the tires cool and recover, which meant they could never sustain the pace advantage the Daytona's aerodynamics gave them. It was one of the most maddening situations in racing. The fastest car on the track, unable to run at its own speed. Ford and its drivers knew exactly what was happening and used it ruthlessly. David Pearson in the Torino Talladega did not need to match the Daytona's top speed if the Daytona kept shredding its tires every 10 laps. Patience was the Ford strategy, and it worked well enough to give Ford the 1969 NASCAR championship, with David Pearson taking the title, and Richard Petty, who had defected from Plymouth to drive a Ford Talladega that year, finishing second. It was a bitter result for Chrysler, made worse by the fact that everyone at Dodge knew their car was genuinely faster and could not prove it in race conditions. But then something happened at the Texas 500 in December of 1969 that changed the entire calculation. Bobby Isaac drove his Daytona to a race average of 144.277 miles per hour at the Texas World Speedway, beating the Ford entries cleanly and giving Dodge its most convincing superspeedway win of the season. The tire situation had not been fully solved, but the Daytona had finally found conditions where it could sustain enough pace to put the result beyond doubt. Dodge ended the 1969 season with 22 Grand National victories, only 4 fewer than Ford, despite running a car that had debuted halfway through the year. The potential was obvious. What the Daytona could do when the tire problem was solved was a question that kept Larry Rathgeb awake at night, and not because the answer frightened him. The answer excited him enormously, and he was about to find out what it was. March 24, 1970. Buddy Baker arrives at the Alabama International Motor Speedway after a morning of skeet shooting. He is not in a hurry. He has been waiting around all day for the track to dry after heavy rain the night before, and by mid-afternoon he is ready to head to the fishing hole. But Chrysler has brought its chief NASCAR timer and scorer, Joe Upton, down to Talladega with full timing equipment, because the engineers know that today, if conditions hold, Buddy Baker in a 1969 Charger Daytona is going to do something that has never been done on a closed racing circuit in the history of motorsport. He is going to run 200 miles per hour, officially, on the record. With the stopwatches running and the paperwork ready, Baker gets in the car and begins his runs. He hits 195 miles per hour on his early laps, finds his rhythm, and on the 30th lap, the timing equipment records a speed of 200.096 miles per hour. The barrier is broken. The team flags Buddy in to celebrate, and then Larry Rathgeb, standing at the pit wall, tells him the celebration's going to have to wait, because today Baker is a test driver for the Daytona program, and they are not done yet. Baker goes back out. By the end of the day, he has improved his record twice, posting a final official speed of 200.447 miles per hour. He is the first human being to break the 200-mile-per-hour barrier on a closed circuit, and he did it in a car that started life as a street machine built to satisfy a racing rulebook's paperwork requirement. Baker recalled later that Dodge had picked him specifically to make the official record run, and that there was a fair amount of grumbling from the other factory Dodge drivers who felt they deserved the shot. It was the kind of internal politics that happens in any racing program, but on that particular afternoon in Alabama, with the timing equipment running and Joe Upton's stopwatches confirming what the speedometer was showing, none of that mattered. What mattered was the number. 200 miles per hour, in a stock car, on a closed track. Nobody had ever done it before, and nobody had come close. The Daytona had proven beyond any argument what it was capable of when the conditions were right and the tires held together. And by this point in the 1970 season, Dodge had quietly handed the winged car program to its Plymouth division, which had built its own version of the same concept around the Roadrunner body. The Plymouth Superbird, with Richard Petty back from his year driving Fords, painted in Petty blue, number 43, ready to win races. Petty won 18 of them in 1970, including the Daytona 500, and the combination of the Daytona's record speed and the Superbird's racing dominance created a problem that nobody at Chrysler had fully anticipated. NASCAR was watching all of this very carefully, and the people running stock car racing in America were beginning to have a conversation that Chrysler was not going to enjoy. NASCAR had a problem, and the problem had a wing on it. By the end of the 1970 season, the numbers coming out of Talladega and Daytona and every other superspeedway on the calendar were making the people who ran stock car racing deeply uncomfortable. The winged Chrysler cars were not just fast. They were fast in a way that exposed how badly the sport's safety infrastructure had fallen behind the technology on the track. Tires were failing at speeds they had never been designed to handle. The banking angles that felt reasonable at 160 miles per hour became genuinely dangerous at 200. And there was a broader, uglier problem that nobody in the NASCAR offices wanted to say out loud, but everyone understood. If Chrysler kept winning like this, Ford was going to leave. And if Ford left, the sport lost half its narrative, half its rivalry, and a substantial portion of its audience. The Ford versus Chrysler war was the engine that drove fan interest as much as any V8 under any hood. NASCAR needed that war to stay competitive, not to end with one side running away with every trophy. So NASCAR did what powerful organizations always do when the rules stop producing the results they want. They changed the rules. The decision came down in the winter between the 1970 and 1971 seasons, and it was as elegant as a knife between the ribs. NASCAR announced that for 1971, any car with an engine larger than 305 cubic inches would be restricted to a smaller carburetor that would choke its power output. 305 cubic inches. The Chrysler Hemi was 426 cubic inches. The 440 wedge was 440. To keep running the winged cars with their big engines, Chrysler would have had to accept a power restriction so severe that the aerodynamic advantage of the nose and wing would be completely neutralized. The only alternative was to fit the Daytona and Superbird with a tiny 5-liter engine, which made even less sense given what these cars had been built to do. It was a rule written in one boardroom to kill a car built in another, and everyone involved knew exactly what it was. Chrysler had already been testing new designs for 1971 at Wichita State University's wind tunnel, running 3/8 scale models of Chargers and Roadrunners, with new wing configurations and nose cone variations, trying to find the next generation of the Aero car formula. Those wind tunnel sessions stopped almost immediately. The program that had cost Chrysler more money than it had made on every single winged car it sold was over, killed not on a racetrack but in a rulebook. But the regulatory death of the Daytona on the superspeedways was only one part of the story. The other part was happening in dealership parking lots across America, and it was almost as painful. When Dodge had originally announced the Daytona to its dealer network, the response had been confusion bordering on panic. Dealers who received their allocation of winged cars in the summer of 1969 had no idea what to do with them. The cars looked like nothing else on Earth, which was the point when you were trying to qualify a racing machine. But it was considerably less helpful when you were trying to sell it to a family in suburban Ohio who just wanted a nice muscle car. Some dealers reportedly tried to remove the nose cones and wings before putting the cars on the lot, which would have been both expensive and catastrophically stupid from a collector standpoint. Though nobody was thinking about collectors in 1969, they were thinking about moving units. Dodge had lost between $1,000 and $1,500 building each Daytona, and now some of those cars were sitting on dealer lots with price tags that made ordinary buyers hesitate. The Daytona cost about $3,860 at base, which was reasonable for what it was. But the wing made people nervous in ways that were hard to articulate. You could not take it through an automatic car wash. The nose extended so far forward that parking required a recalibration of your spatial awareness, and the state police in multiple states had pulled Daytona drivers over purely out of curiosity, which was flattering but did not help move metal off the lot. What happened next was something that would make every Mopar collector in the following decades want to travel back in time and shake those dealers by the shoulders. Because the cars that did not sell quickly were eventually discounted. Dealers who could not move their Daytonas at sticker started cutting prices, and then cutting them again. A car that Dodge had built at a loss. A car that had just set the all-time closed-course land speed record for stock cars. A car that had literally changed what people thought was physically possible in American motorsport was being sold off at whatever price it took to get it off the lot. Some buyers got them for less than $3,000. They drove them home, parked them in garages, and forgot about them for a decade. When the collector market eventually woke up to what these cars were, those same Daytonas started selling for figures that would have seemed hallucinatory to the dealers who had practically given them away. A Hemi Daytona crossed the Mecum auction block in 2024 for $3.3 million. The car that some dealers could not move in 1969. Meanwhile, Ford was not entirely innocent in the Aero wars that NASCAR had just shut down. While Chrysler was absorbing the impact of the new rules, Ford had been developing its own winged car for the 1971 season, a machine called the King Cobra based on the new Torino body, with a long aerodynamic nose similar to the Daytona and Superbird. 3 prototypes were built. And then NASCAR announced its engine restrictions, and Ford quietly shelved the entire program before a single King Cobra ever turned a wheel in competition. Those 3 prototypes survived and are today among the most prized and obscure artifacts of the entire Aero war era. Ghost cars from a battle that ended before they got to fight in it. The irony was almost too neat. Ford had spent years trying to beat the Daytona on the track and never quite managed it on pure speed. In the end, it was NASCAR's rulebook that gave Ford the victory Dearborn's engineers had been unable to earn at full throttle. The winged warriors were gone. The superspeedways would never again see anything quite like them. And somewhere in a dealership lot in Alabama, a bright orange Daytona with a wing taller than most men was waiting for someone to figure out that they were looking at history. But the Daytona was not finished making its mark on American culture. Not even close. Because the car that NASCAR had banned from the track was about to find a second life in the most unexpected place imaginable. And it would reach more Americans through that second life than it ever had on the banking at Talladega. There is a moment in American popular culture where a machine stops being a machine and becomes a myth. For the Ford Mustang, it happened in Bullitt. For the Pontiac Firebird, it happened in Smokey and the Bandit. And for the Dodge Charger Daytona, it happened on a dirt road in Hazard County, Georgia, on a television screen in the living rooms of 30 million Americans every Friday night. The Dukes of Hazzard premiered on CBS in January of 1979, a full decade after the Daytona had been built, and nearly 8 years after NASCAR had effectively banished the winged cars from competition. The show's most famous prop was a bright orange 1969 Dodge Charger, called the General Lee. And while the General Lee was a standard Charger rather than a full Daytona with nose cone and wing, the show did more for the Charger nameplate than any racing victory ever had. Suddenly, every American kid who watched television knew what a Dodge Charger looked like, knew the sound of that engine, knew the feeling of what it meant to drive something that loud and that fast and that orange through the southern countryside. The Daytona rode that wave of renewed Charger worship directly into the consciousness of a generation that had been too young to watch it run at Talladega. And the timing could not have been better, because by the late 1970s, the original Daytonas that had been sold off cheap from dealership lots were starting to surface in the hands of collectors who understood exactly what they had. The muscle car market was waking up. People who remembered 1969 were now in their 30s with money to spend, and the cars they had wanted as teenagers were suddenly available at prices that still made sense. A Hemi Daytona that a dealer had practically begged someone to take off his hands for $2,900 in 1970 was now worth real money, and within another decade, it would be worth serious money, and within 2 decades, it would be worth the kind of money that made financial advisors nervous. But the true legacy of the Daytona was not measured in auction prices or television appearances. It was measured in what happened to every other car manufacturer on Earth in the decades that followed. Before the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, aerodynamics in American motorsport was a conversation about keeping the front end planted and reducing obvious drag. It was incremental, cautious, and largely intuitive. What Chrysler did with a team of 6 aerodynamics engineers, a wind tunnel at Wichita State University, and a clay scale model was demonstrate conclusively that you could design a production-based racing car from the outside in, starting with the airflow and building the sheet metal around it. and that doing so would produce speed gains so large they were practically unfair. The lesson was not lost on anyone. Within a few years of the Aero Wars ending, every serious NASCAR team was thinking about aerodynamics in ways they simply had not before 1969. The sport that Bob Roger had described as going funny car racing when he came back from Atlanta in the spring of that year had, in fact, gone exactly that way, and it never came back. The aerodynamic arms race that the Daytona started never stopped. It just moved underground, into wind tunnels and computational fluid dynamics programs, and eventually into the template-based rules packages that define NASCAR today, where every car on the grid runs an identical body shape precisely because the lesson of the Daytona was so thoroughly learned that the sport had to outlaw innovation entirely to keep the competition from running away with itself. Larry Rathgeb, the engineer who had driven the whole program from a set of drawings on a vice president's desk to a world record at Talladega, spent the rest of his career at Chrysler, watching the industry absorb everything he and his team had figured out in that frantic spring and summer of 1969. He gave interviews in later years that made clear he understood exactly what they had accomplished and exactly why it had been taken away from them. The car was too good. In racing, being too good is its own kind of crime. Buddy Baker, the man who had gone skeet shooting on the morning of the most important test run of his career and almost headed to the fishing hole instead, went on to a long and celebrated NASCAR career. He won the Daytona 500 in 1980 driving a Chevrolet, and he remained one of the most beloved figures in the sport until his death in 2015. But when people asked him about the greatest moment of his career, he came back to that afternoon in Alabama on March 24, 1970, when Joe Epton's timing equipment clicked over to 200.096 miles per hour and the crew started waving him in. He said they had all run 200 miles per hour before in unofficial timing, but the official record was the one that counted, and when Dodge picked him to be the one to do it officially, he knew it was the kind of thing a man only gets to do once. He was right about that. What happened to Dodge after the Aero program ended is a story that contains its own particular American irony. The company that had built the most aerodynamically radical production car in the history of Detroit, that had lost money on every single one of them without complaint, because winning was the only thing that mattered, spent most of the 1970s struggling through the oil crisis and the emissions regulations and the general collapse of the muscle car era, along with every other American automaker. The Charger name survived, but the cars that carried it through the mid-70s were shadows of what the name had once meant. The fury and the innovation that had produced the Daytona went quiet for a long time, and then, decades later, when Dodge finally brought the Charger back as a serious performance car, and when the Challenger returned to the market as a genuine muscle car built to make people feel something when they turned the key, the ghost of the Daytona was present in every conversation about what those cars needed to be. The standard had been set in 1969 by 505 cars built in a leased factory in East Detroit by a company that knew it was going to lose money on every single one and did not care even slightly because the point was never the money. The point was the wing, the nose, the Hemi, and the 200 miles per hour that nobody thought was possible until Dodge went ahead and made it happen. 505 cars, 23% less drag than anything Dodge had built before, 199.466 miles per hour in qualifying at a brand new track that Ford had named after itself, 200.447 miles per hour on a Tuesday afternoon in Alabama, with the official timer running and Buddy Baker ready to go fishing, and a rulebook rewritten by the most powerful organization in American motorsport, specifically to stop one car from winning too much. If you grew up loving muscle cars, if you ever stood next to a Hemi engine and felt the ground move when it fired, if you ever watched a NASCAR race and wondered how any of this got started, the answer is sitting right there in a bright orange car with a wing taller than you are and a nose sharp enough to split the Alabama air clean in two. That is where it began. That is what it looked like when Detroit decided to stop playing it safe and build something that scared everyone, including themselves. If this story hit you the way it hit us putting it together, drop a like and let us know in the comments which winged warrior you would take home if you had the choice, the Daytona or the Superbird. And if you are new here, and this is your first time watching, subscribe and stick around, because we have got a lot more of these stories where this one came from, and every single one of them is just as wild.